Tuesday on Daily Delivery. I am Michael Rand. Happy to be back for another day. Hope you guys are all having a tremendous day out there today. Day 2 of Vikings free agency. A flurry of things have already happened, including one already this morning. I'll get into that in just a minute. Marcus Fuller from the Star Tribune joins me here in a little while as well to talk Gophers men's basketball. Lost to Rutgers the other day to end the Big Ten regular season. They play Northwestern in the Big Ten tournament on Wednesday in Indianapolis. Chance for them to maybe get a win there. Northwestern a little bit banged up right now. That would set up a rematch against Wisconsin in the next round. Gophers still playing for plenty of things this season. A potential postseason bid, maybe an NIT berth, something like that. Obviously, the dream of making a huge run in the Big Ten tournament, winning it all, getting to the NCAA tournament, that's still on the table for them, but that is a tall ask. And the biggest thing, of course, is Ben Johnson's status for next season. Marcus and I will get into all of that here in just a minute. First, though, what I miss, we're going to go Vikings pretty heavily here in the first segment today. 3 points I want to make about free agency so far. Number one, Sam Darnold, the story we've been talking about ad nauseum for, a month and a half, almost 2 months now. Would they keep him? Would he go? It has reached its logical conclusion. Sam Darnold heading to Seattle. 3 years, a little over $100 million, $55 million guaranteed. That contract to me is interesting. It says two things to me. One, it says that Seattle, Seattle was in the market for a quarterback. They traded Geno Smith to the Raiders, so obviously they knew what they were up to. They wanted to pursue Sam Darnold in that way. But it says to me his market wasn't maybe as huge as some people were making it out to be. You heard, 3 years for $120. The guaranteed to $55 million, a little bit less, I think, than some people were expecting. And I think maybe, as Ben Gessling wrote today, as a lot of us can kind of piece together, the end of Sam Darnold's season, those last 2 games, the regular season game against Detroit, the playoff game against the Rams. And by the way, I think the game against the Lions was far more egregious than the game against the Rams. I know he didn't handle pressure well against the Rams. He, ran backwards too much, took 9 sacks, some of which were on him. But the Lions game, he just missed so many throws against a defense that had been terrible for most of the stretch run and was, again, terrible in the playoffs and getting shredded by Washington. So I thought that was the worst of his 2 games by far. But both of them added up to be like, okay, what is this guy really? Is this the 14-2 quarterback who was great for most of the season? Is this a guy who finished up with 4,300 yards, 35 touchdowns, but doesn't have much of a track record beyond that? So you're talking about people evaluating that body of work for an entire career and evaluating how the season ended. And I think that definitely impacted his market. He still gets paid $55 million guaranteed, sets him up for life, no doubt about it. He'd never had that big payday as a quarterback, but it was not maybe the massive deal that he could have commanded had the season ended more favorably for him. Now, if the season had ended more favorably for him, the Vikings might have considered trying to re-sign him. Seems like the terms that he got from Seattle, the Vikings could have finessed their way into the Sam Darnold conversation if they really did want to keep him. $55 million guaranteed, $100 million over 3 years. That would not have been cost prohibitive. It would have kept them from doing some of the other things they've done in free agency, which we'll get to in a minute here. But it would not have been cost prohibitive, I don't think, if you can kind of play around with the numbers, add some void years, things like that. You could have gotten his cap number into a manageable spot most seasons if you believed that Sam Darnold was your guy. Obviously, they have a different plan. I agree with that plan. Their plan is J.J. McCarthy for the long term, maybe even this season right away. We'll see about that. But they could, it looked like they could have really had Sam Darnold at a certain price if they had wanted to. And, it probably got close to the point where, would he come back for a year, try to beef up his market? But I think in the end, he had to take the money. He goes to a pretty good situation in Seattle where they've had a pretty good history. They've had a pretty good legacy. He gets to work with Clint Kubiak, like all sorts of things there that should benefit him. But interesting that his market maybe wasn't quite as robust as some people might have thought. Point number 2, the Vikings getting help where they needed help, namely in the secondary, which is not a surprise, and up the middle on offense and defense. That's where they've been spending their money so far. The big move announced Tuesday morning, Jonathan Allen. Excellent defensive tackle. 3 years, $60 million, formerly of Washington. He was released this offseason. He's 30 years old right now. I think Andrew Kramer from the Star Tribune tweeted that, in the last 6 seasons, his last 6 healthy seasons, he's averaged 46 pressures, 46 quarterback pressures, and the Vikings haven't had an interior lineman who has had even 40 pressures in a season since Sheldon Richardson in 2018. So obviously he is going to help disrupt the quarterback with up the middle rushes, which they have not had nearly enough of. They haven't drafted guys. They haven't drafted defensive tackles who are pass rushers. They haven't had that kind of push up the middle in recent years that can really affect the quarterback. They have, however, given up a lot of pressure up the middle, which is why you saw them go after center Ryan Kelly, 4-time Pro Bowler from the Colts, a fairly modest deal. He's 31 years old, $9 million guaranteed, 2 years, $18 million overall. So not a huge contract, but somebody who definitely seems to be an upgrade over Garrett Bradbury. Bradbury's got another year left on his deal, but it's not guaranteed money, so you can imagine his time with the Vikings might be over. That certainly sounds like an upgrade for the Vikings there. So those 2 things so far, helping out up the middle, and then obviously in the secondary, Byron Murphy Jr. coming back to the Vikings, 3 years, $66 million. Now we'll see Murphy and Allen. We'll see what the final contract numbers are. Sometimes you hear 3 for 60, 3 for 66, and you're like, wow, that's a lot of money. Sometimes the actual terms reveal that those are kind of like inflated a bit with, incentives, things like that. We'll see what the actual kind of big numbers are, but he's had 2 great years with the Vikings, 6 picks last year. I think he tied for the lead among cornerbacks, tied for 3rd among the lead in all players last season. So getting rewarded handsomely, bet on himself before the 2024 season, and he is getting the rewards from that. Also signing Isaiah Rodgers from the Eagles. 2 years, $15 million. He only played 36% of defensive snaps for the Eagles last season, so, kind of could be in the middle there of where he's going to be, what kind of role he's going to have, but maybe looking for an elevated role with the Vikings. So that's an interesting one. The departures are a little bit interesting too. I mean, they re-signed Aaron Jones, they re-signed Theo Jackson, but some departures are interesting. Cam Bynum reportedly going to the Indianapolis Colts, so maybe a bigger role next year for Theo Jackson, the guy they did re-sign. Obviously, we already talked about Darnold. We talked about now Pat Jones going to the Panthers, Nick Mullins and Johnny Munt going to the Jacksonville Jaguars. So the Nick Mullins era is over. But the bigger point there is pressure up the middle. That has been a thing that's plagued the Vikings on both sides of the ball. They are trying to address that, starting to address that this offseason. Wonder if there are more moves to come on Tuesday. Final point is the money goes fast, doesn't it? They entered this offseason with $60 million in cap space. Again, we're going to have to see how these deals are structured, exactly what the cap numbers for all these big ticket free agents are this season. They didn't do Darnold, so obviously we know they had that extra room. They're going to gotta go cheaper at quarterback this year and in the foreseeable future, but they're probably still going to need to sign a backup quarterback. That's going to cost them a little bit of money. They're probably still looking at at least one more offensive lineman, maybe a guard, maybe still looking for a little bit more help at corner, but maybe those are more fringe moves. But that money goes fast, $60 million. If the cap number is just split evenly for Jonathan Allen and Byron Murphy, that would be $42 million right now. And it's probably not how that's going to be distributed. You're going to see bigger numbers, smaller numbers, but it's kind of like, you go shopping at Target, Costco, wherever you go, and you're like, I've got a budget, and you're like, man, I got this and that, and I'm already getting pretty close to my budget. So even though the Vikings have a lot of cap space this season, it does still feel like they have a need or two more than the cap space they have allotted. Now, maybe they're going to address some of that in the draft. The problem there is they don't have a ton of draft capital, right? They've only got the first-round pick, what's likely to be a third-round compensatory pick for Kirk Cousins, and then a couple of fifth-round picks. They're really going to feel the pinch from all of what they did last year to leverage kind of the big-ticket players, the big-name swings they took. Dallas Turner cost a lot of draft capital last season. They're going to miss the second, third, and fourth-round picks this season, especially if he doesn't have a monster year in 2025. So watch that. It feels like they've got a lot of cap room. They do. They've got some more space to do a few more things this year. I'm not sure if they're going to be able to address everything you want them to do, though, even though they have more cap space than they've had in a long time. But I think a promising start to free agency for the Vikings, especially with the Jonathan Allen news breaking Tuesday morning, and we'll see what more do we have in store on the rest of Tuesday and into the rest of free agency.
Open a smart checking account at Royal Credit Union to get no monthly fees, no minimum balance, and a $250 bonus. See details at rcu.org/checking bonus. No minimum balance required to obtain bonus. Offer ends 5/31/25. Insured by NCUA.
It's good to be talking Gophers men's basketball with Marcus Fuller today from the Star Tribune. Marcus, how you doing?
Good. How about you?
I'm good. Watched a decent amount of that Gophers-Rutgers game on Sunday. Kind of seemed like one that the Gophers might pull out again. They've had a lot of close games. I believe they said on the broadcast, too, that if they would have won that game, it would have been their most Big Ten road win since their Final Four season, something like that. I mean, it was certainly even with losing it, it was their most, I think he wrote, since 2017, right?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, they play more games now than they did previously. The league's expanded to 18, and they've got 20 Big Ten games. They used to have 16, 18. But, yeah, I mean, the stretch this year for road games, they had won four in a row before Rutgers. That would have been 5 in a row if they had gotten that, and that would have been the most since, even beyond the Final Four year. I'm not sure if they won 5 in a row, but they did win 7 that year in the Big Ten, and I think that was a 16-game schedule. Winning 5 was pretty amazing for this team, for any team, in that regard. I think in the Big Ten, they were top 4 or 5 as far as road record going into that game. And we're talking about the Michigan States and, Michigan, Purdue's, and teams that are going to have high seeds in the NCAA tournament. I look back on the years that they made the NCAA tournament, and really you only had to get 2 or 3, even 1 year, they only had to get 1 road win in the Big Ten in order to help themselves. So having 5, there's a lot of teams on the bubble that wish they had that. Only winning 2 games in the Big Ten at home cost them probably an NCAA tournament bid.
Who are they then? Are their kind of season was all over the map, right? Because they started out 0-6 in the Big Ten, then to finish what amounts to, I guess, 7-7 in their last 13 or last 14 regular season games in the Big Ten. All those road wins, good wins, but then some bad losses, only being able to win 2 games in the Big Ten at home. Like who are they? Which one is closer to the reality, or is all of it their reality?
Yeah, I mean, you answered it right there. I mean, this team is an enigma. I don't know what other way to say it. I mean, they haven't had this kind of road record in a long time, but they also have won more home games previously, and last year's team is a good example of our team that was on the bubble for a long time. They thought they were going to play in the NCAA tournament because they had won so many games at home. I think it ended up being 16 of their 19 wins on the season were at home.
Okay.
And one of those were, I'm including the NIT.
Right.
So,
right.
I mean, they did all of their winning at home last year. And that was a team that probably was a few wins away on the road from making the NCAA tournament. If they would have had this road record, they might have, competed for the top half of the Big Ten. So, yeah, this team, they do play differently on the road. They're a veteran team that doesn't get rattled by the hostile environment. They play well down the stretch, even though it didn't work out versus Rutgers. I think a couple free throws and defensive stops here and there, and they would have won that game like they had done 5 others. So yeah, they play differently on the road, different kind of mentality. At home, I think there's a lot more pressure. They started off 0-6, so they were desperate to win, and then they won those 2. They beat those 2 ranked opponents. At that time, they were the heavy underdog. And I'll be honest. There are probably a lot of teams that overlook them. It's different when you're expected to win and people are gunning for you, and really the teams that they played, like Penn State, Northwestern, and Washington at the time, they were in need of wins to make the Big Ten tournament. Right. You could even say that they were maybe more desperate than the Gophers. So they just not have responded well to being the underdog. The favorite.
Yeah.
And that's just it's a different animal that they had this year.
We'll get back to the Big Ten tournament in a minute because they play in the first round of that Wednesday against Northwestern, the 12 versus 13 game. And there was a question at some point in the season, certainly when they were 0-6, would they even get to the Big Ten tournament, because the bottom 3 teams in the conference standings now miss the Big Ten tournament, but they get to the Big Ten tournament. But what do we attribute the better play to? Obviously, Dawson Garcia was very good all season, but it feels like the supporting cast got better as the year went along. Guys like Patterson stepped up. You had Rigsby in a few games. Like, how did they get better to be 7-7 in their last 14?
Well, I don't think they were as bad as the 0-6 record. Okay. We'll put it that way. And then they lost to North Texas in the beginning of the season at home. North Texas almost won their conference. They beat Memphis, who's a nationally ranked team who I might have in my bracket going far. We'll see. And then, they had to play that without Mike Mitchell, one of their starters, a guy that, was there last year, had experience. They went to Orlando and they lost 2 games there to Wichita State, and Wake Forest without Mike Mitchell as well, and so it's hard to judge a team when they don't have their full complement of players. So those 3 losses, you could say maybe at least 2 of them or even 1 that they would not have had if Mike Mitchell was there.
Okay.
At that time, Brandon Rigsby was starting, playing a lot of minutes. Frank Mitchell just started to get back into the lineup. And those guys just, had to feel how to play with one another, how to play with Dawson. At the time, Dawson was pretty much a one-man show. Lukai Patterson was starting to figure out, how I'm going to be in the backcourt. Am I going to score? Am I going to be the facilitator? His role was different at Charlotte last year. So they didn't really know how to figure themselves out when Mike Mitchell came back until a few games into the Big Ten. Before those, the losses 5 and 6, they were playing a little bit better. Okay. At the end of that 0-6 start, I think they played at Maryland, was a close game. And even though the Wisconsin game was a blowout, it was mainly in the second half where it fell apart. In the first half, they were right there with them. So they were starting to play better at the end of the 0-6. And then that just carried over to desperation mode. I mean, when this team feels like their backs are against the wall, they usually play better. You could argue that Rutgers was even worse, in their situation where they already had a losing record and, the disappointment that they had gone through with 2 future lottery picks. Yeah. And it's their last home game. They really wanted to win that one. But it could have gone either way. And, the Gophers still ended up getting a 12th seed in the Big Ten tournament. And, they're in a good spot playing Northwestern again, a team that they really could have beaten at home. Northwestern's losing 2 of their top players to injuries. And so I think that's a pretty good matchup for the Gophers. And if they win that, they'll play Wisconsin in the second round.
Okay. And so opportunity there, of course, because they're overall now 1 game under 500. But if they were able to beat Northwestern and then upset Wisconsin, they would guarantee themselves of at least a 500 finish, start to maybe think about some sort of postseason tournament at that point? We're getting ahead of ourselves, but like what do they have to play for still at this point? Is that kind of outside of making some sort of dream run and, you know, reeling off 5 wins in the Big Ten tournament? Like what do they have at stake here?
I mean, this team is mostly seniors, so they're just playing. They're playing to play as long as they can, you know, whatever that means. I don't think that it's a shoo-in that they'll make the postseason if they finish 500. I mean, they'll have an incredible resume as far as quad 1 wins. You know, if they all hold up, they'll have like about 8 quad 1 wins.
It's amazing.
I don't know if there's ever been a high major team with that many quad wins that didn't make the NCAA tournament. You know, I'll have to look that up. So
and they're not even close. Like they've got so many quad 1 wins, but you know, too many quad 2 and 3 losses.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not just that. Like the net ranking isn't just about wins and losses. It's how you play. You know, it's efficiency. Sure. So, you know, even in their wins against really poor teams, they didn't necessarily blow them out or play that well. And then, you know, obviously they lost to some teams in their conference in the beginning. They were just getting blown out. You know, so that just it really skews your net ranking, and then it's hard to dig out of that. You know, the Gopher women's team is like the opposite, right? They have a really good net ranking because they're really efficient in blowing out bad teams. And then a couple teams in the Big Ten that they should have beaten, they beat pretty well, but they didn't have any quad 1 wins, you know, or, you know, marquee quality wins, you know, with the respect of the resume. So, yeah, the men's team, you know, could they sneak into the NIT? Sure. There's a new Crown tournament this year that's in Vegas. It was created to attract some of the high major teams that don't make the NCAA tournament. I think the Big 12 and the Big 10 are the 2 conferences that are going to benefit from that. So, you know, you're taking away some teams from potentially the NIT. So then it'll go, you know, below that. And, you know, the Gophers are right there if they can finish 500 or even not. I mean, I think the NIT went away with that. Got to be. I mean, they're just going to make a decision the way they make a decision, you know. So, like if they had Kentucky 1 game below 500, they probably they'd take Kentucky, you know, that just all of a sudden slid at the end of the season. But yeah, they just want to keep playing. I mean, to be honest, if you beat Northwestern, you got a chance to beat Wisconsin for the first time under Ben Johnson. I mean, you know, that's a huge game for them, you know. And if they get that win, you know, whether they make the NIT or not, you know, all of a sudden you've kind of made something of yourselves at the end of the season that, you know, hey, this is the potential we had and we're finally showing it, you know. And in the backdrop of all that is, you know, a coaching situation that is uncertain, you know, for next year. Ben Johnson does have 2 years left on his contract, you know, and Mark Coyle has been supportive, you know, up until this season, quite a bit going into this season, that he's been kind of dealt a bad hand as far as, you know, with NIL and then the money that they weren't able to get together to keep some of those players from last year, you know. So I think with resources coming, with revenue share and possibly bigger NIL recruiting budget, you know, what can he do with that? Because I tell you what, if he had that last year, this team, I would have predicted him to make the NCAA tournament.
I think that's fair, and I think go ahead. Well, and I think you just laid out the fundamental question: like, has Ben Johnson not been able to get this program to turn a certain corner because he isn't fundamentally a good or great coach, or because he doesn't have the resources? And I think that's the question. If he gets enough resources, again, with you and Chip have reported that they're probably going to put more of this revenue sharing into men's basketball than maybe the NIL has been into men's basketball. So maybe raising that floor up a little bit. Now, obviously, every program is going to have the benefit of that, or most programs, if they spend to the max, are going to have that money too. But it does raise the floor and gives you more possibilities. So fundamentally, like, is it a question of his coaching or is it a question of resource? And I think that's the thing that Coyle's got to decide.
Yeah, I mean, there's Hall of Fame coaches that are getting out of the business. And, you know, I'm pretty sure they can coach, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So, but they don't want to deal with the other side of it, you know? So I do think that it's become a big business of, you know, can you pay pay the right, money for players. And, it's not recruiting high school players as much anymore as it is, and developing those players. It's, how much can you pay for a transfer? How long will that player stay if he's not a senior? And if you do recruit a couple high school kids and you develop them, can you retain them?
Right.
Because I think they've done a really good job of keeping, some of the transfers like Dawson
Garcia,
and Mike Mitchell, Parker Fox. Some of those guys could have left. They were key pieces to last year's team. But there are a couple more that, when you keep these three, can you pay the others? In the ideal world, they would have had, 4 of their starting 5 back, and they would have been, even without Cam Christie, who was drafted.
Right.
This is the end of this season and we're still talking about last year, but, it's hard not to, because a few of those players will be probably playing in the NCAA tournament, excuse me, and then having big roles.
Well, it's just a hard way to coach. It's almost, because you're redoing your roster every year if you can't retain these guys. And it's, you're bringing in experienced players like they have, but if they don't know your system, it takes a while to get them all,
It's the reality together. Of college basketball now.
It is.
So the question, Ben Johnson, I think, with more talent, goes to the NCAA tournament this year. We've had coaches that were fired going to the Final Four previous year. Kevin Keats at NC State was fired, and he went to the Final Four last year. Why was he fired? I'm not sure, but he was. The Indiana's coach is resigning. There's a lot of pressure on that job. He went to the tournament a couple times. He probably is going to go this year. They're on the bubble, but what are the expectations for the Gophers program? Not to have a losing record in the Big Ten, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, how much are you paying for your head coach? How much are you paying his staff? How much do you pay to get into the NIL recruiting world, to get transfers? And right now, if you stack all that up, those numbers are at the bottom of the Big Ten. So when you finish at the bottom of the Big Ten and you're putting in money as a team in the bottom of the Big Ten, it lines up. If you put more into the program, you're going to expect more, and then you can judge it, in my opinion, on the level of a lot of other teams that are spending money.
You're saying he has 2 years left on his contract. After this season, there's 2 more beyond this one?
Yeah, so it's 26, 27. It'll end.
Okay. Yeah. So that kind of makes me wonder if he gets 1 more year with resources, and not necessarily an extension beyond this season, but just like kind of a prove it year. And whether that's, whether 1 year is fair or not, at least it gives him a chance to play with some resources and see where it goes. And then maybe a decision about an extension or not. But it's hard too, right? Like sometimes you don't take a coach into that, 1 year left on his contract, because then it's harder to recruit high school players. So I have a hard time. I have a hard time knowing what's fair in this scenario.
I think nobody thinks beyond. It's year to year now. Nobody thinks beyond 1 year. Okay. I mean, sure, if you or I want to have a contract that we're working past this year, right? But it's year to year. No coach is safe, and no coach is. They're all human, and can they handle the climate now?
Yeah.
I mean, did I think Tony Bennett was going to leave Virginia? He's not young, but he's young enough where, he's got at least a decade more to coach before, like the Mike Krzyzewskis of the world and those guys retired and, in their 70s and almost 80. Tom Izzo's still going strong. Rick Pitino, a lot of these guys, they're built for this, but some aren't, and you don't know until you try. I don't know what, I don't like making predictions, about coaching, but I do think that, the next coach, obviously, or Ben Johnson, is going to have a lot more to work with. And then I think they should be judged, like a lot of these other schools. and there are teams below the Gophers, and what they put into NIL,
but not a lot.
Right,
they're
not a lot.
They're in the bottom third, right? Basically, of what we know. So I don't know. I mean, and I don't know how much the Big Ten tournament comes into play, but if I think the games still do matter. If they lose to Northwestern and don't look good doing it, I don't know if it's like a small piece of it. If they beat Northwestern and then beat Wisconsin or have a good showing against Wisconsin, maybe that factors in too. So still stuff to play for. And like you said, like these seniors want to keep playing as long as they can. Every year they're seniors. They want to play as long as they can, right? All these guys are always seniors on this team, it seems like.
Yeah, I mean, this is a team, one of the oldest teams in college basketball. And they played like it on the road. They just haven't played like it anywhere else. But there's some talent that could be coming back. Obviously, in this world, you don't know who's coming back, but there have been some non-seniors who've played well this year. Isaac Asima was a freshman. Frank Mitchell's really come along in the last few games, and he's been the inside presence that they always hoped that he would be in the Big Ten. And he's one that depending on who you get in the portal next year, for next season, and the recruits that they're bringing in, a really good recruiting class. There's a lot of pieces there still to be competitive, especially if you're going to spend money.
Well, we'll see what happens Wednesday and beyond. I'm sure we'll talk again fairly soon, depending on whatever that decision is ultimately at the end of the year, what ends up coming of this season. Nobody covers this team, this program better than you, Marcus. Always appreciate you on Daily Delivery, and good luck in Indy, and we'll talk to you soon.
All right. Appreciate it.
Great stuff from Marcus, as usual. Points we like to make, of course. The season's not over, so this discussion is still to be continued. What if the Gophers make a big run in Indianapolis? Does that impact Ben Johnson's future? What if they get blown out by Northwestern and go meekly into the night? Does that impact his future? I don't know how much what the rest of this season does will impact Mark Coyle's decision, but the season's not over, which is a good point to remember. However, let's finish with the cooler. Some listeners have already decided that it's time to move on. A couple people writing in with potential suggestions for who the coach should be. Ed writing in, hey, Mike, lots of basketball programs likely will be interested in Ben McCollum at Drake, maybe even Iowa. What are the chances the Gophers pursue him? Again, Ed, we got to see. We got to see what they're willing to do with the buyout. It'd be $3 million or close to that for Ben Johnson. We have to see if Mark Coyle decides that Ben Johnson deserves another year of more resources that he hasn't had. So I think it's premature to talk names at this point, even if it's fun to speculate about names at this point. So maybe a little early for that conversation, even if it's kind of a fun one to have. Peter says, talking about Ryan Saunders as a possibility for the Gophers, talking about different NBA assistants going to different programs, saying, seems like in the NIL world, college teams are going to closely resemble G League teams. There will be some core players, but most of the ancillary parts will be portal transfers. For the Gophers, if Coyle wants them to be in the top third of the Big Ten for NIL, I could see that an NBA G League assistant used to mixing and matching players would be the right fit. It's an interesting concept. Maybe the college game needs to think about a different model for head coaches because of the new way things are going in college basketball. Somebody who's not so much developing guys over 3 or 4 years, but somebody who can take new parts and quickly get them integrated into a system that can win right away, where you're going to have new players, a lot of new players every year. I think that's a good point. I think it's an interesting thought. I'm not so sure about specific names, but I do think that's an interesting thought about what kind of player or what kind of coach they might want to pursue if they do decide to go in a different direction. That will do it for me today. Chris Hine expected to join me on Wednesday's show to talk Timberwolves. They play Denver on Wednesday night. I'm sure there'll be more Vikings free agency talk on Wednesday's show as well. Until then, I'm Michael Rand. Have a great rest of your Tuesday. Back at it again tomorrow.